It's Easter time, and instead of celebrating with the invasive Easter bunny, many Australians are instead celebrating with our own homegrown Easter icon, the Bilby. And today it's my pleasure to introduce one of our wonderful wildlife ecologists, Aly Ross, who's speaking to us from Yucumurra in South Australia. Thanks for joining us, Aly.
Thanks for having me. I'm coming from Yucumurra Sanctuary, which is on Nguruku land, and I'm really excited to talk about the Easter Bilby.
Excellent. And I hope everyone's had their hot cross buns and ready for a great chat. So, Aly, you've worked extensively with Bilbies at a number of different projects, not just within AWC, but also at Arid Recovery, a wonderful project further north in South Australia. First of all, can you describe to us what this animal is like? We talk about them as the answer to Australia's Easter bunny. What do they actually look like?
They might look a bit similar on the outside, just those long ears is what everyone notices. But when you get a good look at them, there's hardly any similarities at all. So they are a marsupial, they have a pouch. Their fur, you can see from this photo, they're quite fluffy. And if anyone's lucky enough to ever feel a bilby, that it's literally like touching a cloud. Your fingers can't register that you've touched the fur. That's how soft they can get. And those ears are really important, not only for hearing, obviously, but they're also great for heat dispersal in the desert, where obviously the bilby resides or used to reside historically. So the bilby we've got at Yucumurra, and we've also got a couple of other populations across the Australian Wildlife Conservancy sanctuary network. And we're really lucky to be able to work with such a beautiful and different species, definitely different to a lot of the other animals that we have.
Different to bunnies. And yeah, so you've got them at Yucumurra, but this is a species that was really widespread. We know that at the time of European colonization, this species, the greater bilby, covered about 70% of the Australian landmass. Today, it's been wiped out from about 4/5 of that historical range. So it's missing from large chunks of its former distribution. I feel like I've said that so many times talking about Australian mammals. It's the classic story of decline. What's the status of these animals, Aly, in Australia now?
Yeah, so like you said, we lost them from 4/5 of their former range. And I just want to highlight how important that is in terms of obviously losing any animal from any area locally is bad. But for the bilbies, they provide such an important function to the environment that when we lose the animal, we're not just losing the animal, we're also losing that function. And so I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this for a lot of species, but bilbies in particular provide such a different role in the environment. So we actually call them ecosystem engineers. And the fact that what they do in the environment is they make little diggings where they search for food, and they also build these warrens. And both of those things are so important to the arid ecosystem that losing them changes the environment that they're in. Just the fact of not having bilbies changes the habitat. And so we might talk about that a bit later, but yeah, so we lost them from 4/5 of their former range. So things are looking up for the species at a local level, but definitely still in the wild outside of fenced sanctuaries, not so great with that huge decline from where they used to occur.
Yeah, we'll come back to that Bilby Census and talk through some of those different projects where we've re-established populations within their former range, and they've been incredibly successful. Aly, you actually live and work at one of these sanctuaries with a reintroduced Bilby population at Yucumurra. What's it like living around these animals and having them presumably in your backyard?
It is cool because the Yucumurra accommodations are inside the fence, so it doesn't mean I get to open my door and there are numbats and bettongs just literally right outside my door. But 99% of the time, the interaction I have with bilbies is rolling my ankle, because the pits that they dig are like this deep, and anyone with weak ankles like me will know that that is perfect ankle rolling height. So bilbies like to leave those holes like directly outside of my door, so that's a nice gift in the morning. But apart from that, when you actually do see them, obviously they're quite shy, so seeing them is very rare. So every sighting is exciting. And when you do see them, the thing that you usually see isn't actually the animal in its entirety just going about its life. It's usually the animal running away from you. So what you see is that tail wagging in the air. It's not like a normal run like any other animal you might consider running away from you. The tail sort of like behind the bilbies that move.
It's almost like a flag or something, isn't it? It's like this big fluffy bit on top that really does wave around as they're running away from you. It doesn't seem like a very good way of staying hidden from predators. And we might come to that next, because the work you did for your PhD was specifically looking at bilby interactions with different predators. And we know that, you know, the big decline we talked about, disappearing from 4/5 of their range, that was largely coincident with the arrival of cats and foxes in Australia and their spread throughout much of the arid zone, and in fact right across the continent. Basically, wherever fox populations are established, bilbies have gone. So they seem to be very intolerant of that sort of predation. We know cats also have an effect, and are very efficient, effective predators of animals of this size. So, Ali, what were the questions that you were asking in your PhD about how predators and bilbies interact?
I was really interested in looking at, so a lot of people would have heard the term prey naivety. And so that refers to animals that have been separated from predators for long enough that they no longer recognize the predator as a predator, and then they no longer produce the correct response to that predator. So this can happen over a lifetime. You know, if you put an animal in a zoo, then sometimes they lose the predation characteristics that they had before the zoo. And this can also happen over an evolutionary time. So this is why it's happened with bilbies and cats and foxes, because they've evolved completely separately. They have no recognition of a cat or a fox. And on top of that, the anti-predator strategies that they have for, you know, native predators like raptors and quolls, they don't work for cats and foxes. So even if they were to deploy those anti-predator behaviors, it'd still result in a mortality. So that's what we call prey naivety. And so my thesis was looking at ways that we can maybe reduce prey naivety or improve the end result of naivety. So ideally reducing mortality.
Okay, so just to unpack that idea a little bit, you're saying that there are, you know, Australia's native animals haven't evolved in the presence of these different sorts of predators. Is that right? So cats and foxes are different enough from the quolls, the hawks, the owls that we do have, our native predators, that native animals don't respond in a way that works, basically.
Yeah, that's so true. Because I mean, most Australian species, when they think they're threatened, they're going to hide under a shrub, which is a great response. When you've got a raptor, you know, hide under a shrub, that's pretty safe. But obviously for a cat, that's no problem for a cat or a fox. They're just going to go into the shrub after you. So so what we were looking at was the behavioral response of bilbies to cats, and we found, I mean, a lot of people found very little response because of that evolutionary naivety, that there's no part of a bilby that has evolved with any part of a cat.
Right. And so that means that their first interaction, which is what we've seen, is that, you know, cats arrive and they get eaten, basically. Is that the result?
That pretty much sums it up, yeah. So one of the things we were doing in my PhD was seeing if we could teach bilbies how to be aware of cats. So this has happened quite a lot with anti-predator training. And what happens is you get a cue that represents the predator you want to train, and you get a negative stimulus. So this is the same as if you imagine like your dog gets in the couch and you go, no. And I'm hoping that a bunch of people in the crowd just jumped right then, because that's what your dog does. You scare your dog, and then the dog will hopefully associate the negative cue with getting on the couch, and then your dog will never do it again. So this works really well for pets. So theoretically, that should work for wild species like bilbies as well. So what people were doing were they, maybe you have the sound of a cat howling, or spray some cat urine, or even have like a stuffed cat. And then you pair that with people were using like rubber bands, like flicking animals with rubber bands, or spraying them in the face with water bottles, or, you know, just freaking the animal out so that they think of that cat thing, the cue, as a negative event, and so they avoid cats. But obviously, if you think about this for a second, any animal that has seen a cat in the wild is dead. There's no, like, cats are such good predators. Even if they're full, they're going to go for that animal. Even if they're not, even if they don't want to eat it, they're still going to attack and kill animals beyond what they need for their calorie intake. So what these training programs found was that animals do change their behavior, obviously, to be scared of cat howls or cat pee or stuffed cats. But in the wild, survival doesn't change, because in the wild, being afraid of a cat howl isn't actually going to stop the cat from eating you. So what is happening at Arid Recovery, and what I looked at for my thesis, was if we can put just like a couple of cats in with a population of bilbies, then can the bilbies teach themselves how to be predator aware? And so theoretically, some of those dumber bilbies, dumber is a bad term, more naive bilbies are getting taken out of the population, and the ones that are left are breeding and creating even smarter and smarter and more aware bilbies.
Yeah.
So that's what we were researching.
People might think of this as, it's kind of like natural selection, but you're accelerating it or giving it a helping hand by limiting that threat posed to the bilbies. It's still kind of survival of the fittest, but without the threat being so dire that it's too strong a selection pressure.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, theoretically, that is how it should work, that we're accelerating evolution to the point that we've got a population that can survive with some kind of pressure that they couldn't survive with before. Okay. And so that work is ongoing, but that's what I looked at. I
understand the theory of that, and exposing those bilbies to a limited number of cats within a controlled environment. What results did you see? Like, was there a very clear difference between bilbies that had undergone that kind of training program?
Yeah, so after 2 years with cats, so probably maybe one generation worth, or maybe not even that, of bilbies living with just 5 cats in a large 26-kilometer squared paddock. We then took 21 bilbies from this cat exposed population and 21 bilbies from a population that had never been with cats, and we put them into a totally separate enclosure with twice the number of cats, to sort of imitate what they would experience if we had released them to the wild. And we found that the ones that had cat exposure, they did survive better. And there were a couple of other differences. So the ones that had been exposed to cats, they were more likely to share warrens. So maybe that's something to do, how zebras form packs, because if you're with a group, then your individual risk goes down. Right. So bilbies are maybe doing the same thing, that when there's a high risk in the environment, they form groups. But the interesting thing, I think this is the most interesting part of the research, was that we conducted some behavioral analysis on the bilbies that had been exposed to cats and the ones that hadn't. And we could not find any differences in the behavior of the bilbies, or just like very minor differences. So when people are conducting these studies exposing animals to the sound of a cat howl and spraying them in the face with water, they're then conducting behavioral analyses to prove that the animal has changed its behavior. But we found that animals that definitely are different because they survive better with cats, there's hardly any behavioral difference that we can measure. And that means whatever behavior these animals are exhibiting to make them better at surviving in the wild with cats, that's not something we can measure. It's something that we haven't thought of yet. So this could be something like they spend more time in their warrens when it gets dark, or they spend less time eating, or they just change what habitat they use. It's probably a whole suite of behaviors, which is super hard to measure. So what we found is that if you want to improve the behavior of an animal to improve its survival, then it's possibly something that we can't measure. It's possibly some pathway that we haven't yet discovered. Wow. And I'll give you a little side thing. This wasn't published, so this is hot off the presses for everyone watching. What we did was super interesting. We happened to catch a wild cat outside the fence while we were doing this study, with this behavioral study. And so out of interest, we put this cat, it was still alive, and it was in a cat cage, and we put it into the enclosure with one of the bilbies that I was watching to see how its behavior was. And what I found was that the bilby hid behind the cat cage because it was scared of me. It knew that I was a predator. I'm the person that chased it with a net to catch it. But the cat, which it was supposed to be aware of because it's just spent 2 years living with cats, didn't even recognize it, did not know that the cat was a predator or a threat. I was the threat. And I think that's so interesting, because this just goes to show that any animal that has seen a cat is dead. So the behavior towards a cat isn't what we want to train these animals. We don't want them to see a cat and be afraid. We want them to be afraid before they even see a cat. The behaviors have to happen before that interaction. And so I think personally, that's the most interesting part of that study.
That's fascinating. And the fact that you can't measure, there's no discernible difference, but some sort of sixth sense that they can, you know, the ones that are surviving have some extra sensitivity to the presence of cats in the environment. Really cool. I guess, you know, the point of all this research is that with bilbies missing from such a large part of their range, we've got a long-term vision for restoring them. And that's, you know, AWC, other conservation organizations doing work in this area. We know that one component of that approach needs to be a network of safe havens, and we'll go through AWC's safe havens shortly. But Aly, what would be your vision for how to get bilbies back out across the landscape in, you know, at a huge scale across all of Australia?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked. I'm not sure if you're aware of the podcast about the magic wand experiment. I've just been listening to this, but the idea being that you have a magic wand that gets rid of all logical, all ethical, all logistic, anything that could be in the way of your experiment, so you can run whatever experiment you want. And for me, I would be really interested to see if we can bring back the function of these animals, not necessarily the populations as they were, because we still have cats in the environment. But so my magic wand experiment, Joey, would be if we have a sanctuary as we have them now, fully fenced, no predators, the animals in them are likely to be naive, because as we know, once you remove predators from an environment, the animals lose those anti-predator behaviors. So we've got a fenced sanctuary of animals that are naive to cats and foxes, and then I would build another fence outside that fence and just put like one cat in it, and then I would allow the animals to disperse freely from inside the inner fence. And so they would then have that outer fence to be trained by the single cat that's out there, and then have another fence outside that, so the population could expand again into maybe 10 cats, maybe a dingo, maybe a fox, however you want to run it. And then from there, they could then expand into the wild. And I think it's a magic wand experiment, because obviously the huge amount of area you would need, it's not even feasible, but in my heart, I can picture it. And so the idea would be that the animals would be in that core population, and then during good years, they would boom outwards, getting progressively less naive as they go, and then they would eventually get into the wild. So theoretically in the wild, you've got all these cats and foxes. They probably wouldn't survive very long, but they would be conducting their function for however long they are surviving in that outbit. And so, like I said at the start, the function of bilbies and a lot of Australian animals is not getting conducted at the moment, because they're gone from their previous ranges. So this function is changing, the lack of the function is changing the habitat they were in. And, you know, if we leave that for too long, then eventually the habitat's going to be so different that it's going to be harder for them to exist in those spaces that they used to. So this just works like classic boom and bust that used to occur in Australia 200 years ago, that they would have their core population, as all animals used to, and then in good years they boom out, and in bad years they bust back in. But theoretically, you could then improve the functional role of the animal in the environment in boom years, so that in some future where there are fewer cats, or we figure out how to reduce cats and foxes in the environment, then the environment can still hold those animals. So that is my magic wand experiment.
It's a great vision for you know, how we might get bilbies back out at scale. Like you said, there's logistical, you know, challenges with working at that large scale, but you know, that's the kind of work that needs to be done. Large scale experiments. We know that the network of safe havens will be critical for, in the first instance, retaining the diversity among bilby populations, genetic diversity, adaptability to different conditions, and having populations not just in the sort of northern sandy deserts in Western Queensland where they've persisted, but also back in places like Yucumurra, where it's mallee vegetation, quite different to where those wild populations survive. And, you know, knowing that each of those populations will adapt to some degree to their local environment. So having multiple populations, big enough populations that we've got that adaptability within the overall bilby species is very important for future-proofing, you know, that species.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're working towards more of managing populations as a meta population. So obviously the idea of having all animals back into the wild where they used to occur is that's the end goal. We want to be so good at our jobs that we don't have jobs anymore is the end goal. But obviously the sanctuaries are vital currently to make sure those animals don't go extinct. And we're looking in the future to manage them as a metapopulation, which will mean transferring animals between sanctuaries to keep that genetic movement alive. That's what would have happened previously. Animals would have been able to disperse freely. And so we'll hopefully be managing a lot of our populations like that, so that we still retain them within those areas. But if one population should fail, then we don't lose the genetic diversity that was in that population because we've been transferring across sanctuaries.
Amazing. Well, we'll get there. I'd like to talk now to the 2023 Bilby Census. And those of you watching may have received our update yesterday in the last few days about this annual census. We've got teams of ecologists like Ali and her colleagues out across all of our sanctuaries. And every year we do targeted monitoring of reintroduced species, of indicator species that tell us something about the landscape and the health of the environment overall, and also of threatening processes. And this feeds into our eco-health monitoring program. We aim to produce a scorecard at each of our sanctuaries and partnership sites that sums up the ecological health of each of those projects. For reintroduced mammals like the bilby, it's a great update this year. So our census, as Ali mentioned, shows that populations are continuing to grow within our safe haven network. I'll just pull up a map that shows the 6 sites where we have reintroduced bilbies. And these sites are, like I mentioned, right across Australia, from the wheat belt through South Australia, the Northern Territory, and into New South Wales. I might start with Western Australia. At Mount Gibson, the most recent population estimate there is over 1,700 animals. That's absolutely a record for that site, and it's actually a significant percentage of the overall bilby population in Australia, certainly the largest that AWC protects, and it's a significant boost on previous estimates there. Mount Gibson is one of our quite well-established fenced areas. So the first reintroductions of bilbies happened there from 2016, which is probably why, within that almost 8,000 hectare safe haven, it's been able to support such a high number of bilbies. Newhaven in Central Australia, it's one of our newer projects, and some of you may have visited Newhaven over the years. It's slightly larger than Mount Gibson, about 9,500 hectares, beautiful desert country, red sand, spinifex. Bilbies were only released there last year, actually less than 12 months ago. So 66 animals were part of that founder population, and they came from multiple sites, including captive breeding at Taronga Zoo, from a program in Currawinya National Park, as well as other sites. So we know that at least 66 bilbies were put into Newhaven last year. In the months since then, our teams have picked up young animals on camera traps, and they've seen small, baby bilbies hopping around. So that shows at least that some of the joeys that were probably translocated in the pouches have matured. And we hope it also shows that breeding activity has been happening at Newhaven as well. So there are new adults being recruited to the population. The numbers on here, I should say, are a minimum for what we can calculate. Yucumara, Ali, do you want to tell us about the bilby population there? What's the information you've got, and how do you actually monitor bilby populations at Yucca?
So there's a number of different ways you can monitor species. The easiest way is to put cage traps out, and then you get the animal in hand and you get to do a health check and everything. But the problem at Yucumara is we've also got 2 bettong species. We've got burrowing bettongs and brush-tail bettongs. So if I put out 100 cage traps, I'm going to get 99 bettongs and maybe 1 bilby if I'm lucky. So we just completed our bettong survey last week. We did 600 cage traps and we didn't catch a single bilby. So that's the easiest way to catch bilbies if you don't have bettongs. Unfortunately, we do have bettongs. Well, fortunately, we do have bettongs. So the way we conduct our bilby population estimate is by doing a spotlight survey. So we drive along transects at about we just put the car in second gear and let it roll. So that's about 12 k's an hour. It's the easiest survey to volunteer for, by the way, if anybody wants to see a bilby. And so we let the car go at 12 k's an hour, and then every bilby that we see within a certain distance of the transect, we count that, and then we use that to estimate the density of the bilbies and extrapolate that across the whole sanctuary. So last year's estimate was 80 bilbies, so that's the most recent estimate. And our next survey is in 2.5 weeks. And so hopefully we'll have even more then, because we had a really good rainfall at the end of last year. So we're hoping extras.
Awesome. And we'll keep you updated with those numbers too. So to carry on, Scotia Wildlife Sanctuary in Western New South Wales, over 1,000 bilbies. Again, they've been there for several years, so quite a well-established population. And then we've got our 2 partnership sites with New South Wales National Parks at Mallee Cliffs National Park near Mildura, and in the Pilliga Forest, Australia's largest patch of inland forest west of the Great Divide. At each of those sites, 100 at Mallee Cliffs, that was just within the smaller breeding area. We haven't done an estimate yet for the wider fence at Mallee Cliffs, and in the Pilliga, 175 at least. So a fantastic spread of bilby populations. I guess the final thing here is that through our partnership with NAPCO, North Australia Pastoral Company, we know that there are bilby populations on some of those cattle stations in Western Queensland. And while we haven't carried out the surveys required to generate an estimate yet, we do hope so in future years. So each year we're trying to expand this Bilby census to take in more and more of the bilby populations where AWC is involved in conservation, and hopefully beyond AWC populations as well, so that we've got that really clear picture of how this species is tracking across the country. So that's a pretty good update, with more than double the total number of bilbies from our 2022 Bilby census. It's an auspicious sign for a good Easter, I think, and I hope everyone does have a good Easter. Ali, I might just share a video that you sent to me of a bilby coming out of its burrow, and it's like magic, this bilby emerging. So I'll just share that.
We just released bilbies into a new area at Arid Recovery. So this is the first bilby to be released. And after we released it, we saw it digging the sand to make its very first burrow. So this is the first burrow that's been built in that region for, I think they went extinct like 150 years prior to that, from that area. We were trying to get a video of that sand coming out the back. And as we were filming, we noticed this little nose come out, and he put his little head out. And it's possibly the best video I've ever taken in my life, and I will never do better. So that's the very first bilby to be reintroduced to a region that they became extinct from.
Fantastic. That's so cool.
Very cool.
I forgot to mention too, we're running tight on time here, but just that AWC's logo also has special symbolism. You'll be familiar with AWC's logo as a bilby. What you might not be aware of is that it actually represents a second species, the lesser bilby, which has been extinct since about the 60s or 70s. One of the indigenous names for that species was Yalara. And it was chosen as the logo for AWC way back when Martin Copley started the organisation, because it represents so much of what we've lost. It reminds us of extinction being a one-way street. It's, there's no coming back from extinction, but also what we still stand to lose. So we're lucky in that we've still got the other species, greater bilbies, across so many of our sites, and just that responsibility that we have to prevent extinctions, to save these species for future generations. So every time you see the AWC logo, it's good to remember, the symbolism behind it. Ali, I think we might leave it there. That's a really good wrap up of the status of bilbies across AWC sanctuaries, and of your really interesting research into prey naivety, and a vision for how we can restore bilbies across the wider landscape. So I do hope we can bring that vision to life over the next few years and into the future. Thanks, Ali.
That would be nice. No worries. Thanks, Joey. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone who's been watching, thank you for tuning in to AWC in Conversation. It's been great to see so many people returning time and time again. We'll continue with these regular monthly webinars, so stay tuned for the next one. If you've been inspired by this work and you'd like to support or continue supporting AWC's work to conserve our unique wildlife like the bilby, donations over $2 are tax deductible, and you can make a donation at australianwildlife.org.